One of the biggest takeaways was, wait a second, if I'm feeding these fish, mostly GMO fish food, but that's a separate topic, to get them to produce nitrogen, why would I do that when I have an abundant source of nitrogen that I produce myself multiple times per day?
You're listening to How I Grow This, exploring stories of gardeners from across the globe as we learn from their biggest tips and tricks to some of the things not to do. I'm your host, Luke Hammond. Well, welcome everyone. I am so excited to have a good friend of mine, James Fry with Grow Everywhere. I actually first met James via a YouTube ad. I don't know if anybody else got this YouTube ad that had these little tiny green monsters that jumped up, and I was like, oh, tiny green monsters. And I was like, what in the world is this guy? And what is he advertising for? And then I was like, oh, I see what he's doing here. This is like pretty cool. Like this is pretty deep science stuff. And a couple of years ago, I actually reached out to James and he responded to an email and I was super excited about it. And we've kind of been talking about soil and soil health ever since. And so I'm super excited to have James Fry, the founder of Grow Everywhere. You may have seen him on the internet somewhere or maybe receive his emails. So James, welcome to the How I Grow This podcast.
Thanks so much, Luke. It's great to be here, man. And thanks for that intro. The tiny green monster that it's all over the internet, annoying people everywhere, annoying gardeners, annoying gardeners everywhere. Hey,
yeah. So tell me, what is the tiny green monster? Like where did you come up with that brainchild?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So I do have a son who's 11 now, and when he was little, it was always about trying to explain things to him in easy ways that he could understand. So we're in the garden and, I'm explaining about soil microbes and he's like, what's that? And I'm like, well, they're like these little monsters. They're green monsters. And lo and behold, like the next day, I found this puppet, like a little green puppet. And I was like, that's the tiny green monster. So that became the mascot of everything we do. But basically, tiny green monsters are a particular type of soil microbe that it's a bacterial form that loves nitrogen and converts nitrogen into readily available plant food. So that's the non-sciencey analogy. And so ever since then, I've taken I love science and agronomy. My father is a microbiologist, and my grandfather was a rocket scientist and physicist and chemist. And so science is in my blood, and science can also be really boring. So I like to make fun analogies about pretty much everything related to science, and that's how I teach. So that was the impetus of the tiny green monster.
Man, I love that. So I want to backpedal a little bit. So you're also the founder of Grow Everywhere, which kind of has some specific missions, and we're going to go into probably some philosophy on groweverywhere.com and that sort of thing. But first off, how did you get started growing, and what scale do you grow at? What do you like doing in the garden? Let's kind of tell me your garden story, if you will.
Sure. Yeah, so it all started when I was probably 5 years old. Dad and I had a garden in back behind the house, and I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, in the desert, and so back there it started with just dust and clay, and over time it became a place where we could go and actually get food out of it. And so I remember being really little and going back there, and it was a little place that was surrounded by chicken wire that was buried down and goes way up because there's tons of rabbits in the area and jackrabbits and all sorts of stuff that are going to eat your crops. And I remember my dad filling a kitchen pot full of just random food scraps and eggshells and stuff, and it was like this concoction. And I was like, "What is this? What are we doing with this?" And then he's like, "Now throw it in that pile there in the corner." I'm like, "Okay," and then didn't know what we were doing. Come back a week later, and I'm like, oh wow, like none of that food stuff is there anymore. It looks different now. And so we were composting, right? And then I remember just pulling my first carrots out of the ground And, I remember planting them, and as a kid, it's like, whoa, we planted this and it grew, and now I'm eating it. Like, it's just incredible. So we would harvest stuff and then bring it in the kitchen and make it and then eat it. And it's funny because that's how humans used to live. And for me, that was an amazing experience that obviously stayed with me um, through my older years and through college, and the whole journey began. But it began as a very young child. So yeah,
Hmm. So did you end up going to school for any of the growing stuff, or did you kind of lead in a different direction and
I went
then
into a
come
different
back to the
direction.
garden?
I studied economics in school, but I was peripherally involved in agriculture already in college. So through some environmental studies, um, there was a lot of people interested in hydroponics, not just the people growing stuff in the dorm. I was the only person growing food in my dorm with hydroponics. Um, and we got I definitely spent a lot of time on some farms down in central Colorado. Got in touch with some organic farmers and was just yeah, some amazing memories just helping out with early regenerative agriculture down there, um, as well as visiting a variety of different hydroponic grows and stuff, meeting some really smart people. And yeah, that was kind of the beginning of it. I had some friends who were interested. We all got very interested in the production of biofuels from, you know, corn and other feedstocks, and exploring different growing methods. And, long story short, like that, I still don't think that's ever going to work or go anywhere. But it really caused me to come back to growing food and farming and the garden. And so pretty early on through college, agriculture was at the forefront, and economics still there, but not as much. I got the piece of paper to say, yeah, economics, which yeah, whatever. But it was mostly already getting involved in agriculture. So
Well, I think economics, at least 200 years ago, started with agriculture. Like agriculture is the foundation block of every civilization.
absolutely. Now,
The
now you're
thriving
getting
civil Yeah, the
me
thriving
excited.
civilizations have the soils and a thriving agriculture. And then
Absolutely,
as that begins to degrade, so does their economy. And
absolutely.
so that's why we call it a commodity crop, right? Because it's grain that can be stored
Yes.
and then shipped as a price variant, right?
Yep.
In economics. So
Well,
um,
now you're getting me excited because you're right. And in ancient times, so I started late into college, which was earlier, but started getting into alternative economics and kind of exposing that basically everything they're teaching you is based on a lie. So, which is the law that everything is based on fear and scarcity, when the reality is like, wait a second, nature is based on abundance, actually, especially when you know how to work with it. And so, getting into alternative economics, looking at alternative currencies and discovering that, well, the Greeks actually used wine as their store of value, and so they had coins and tokens that were backed by wine. And they also had, I think it was the Egyptians had currency backed by wheat. And so there were all these agricultural products that were the backing right now. So then later in time, we went to the gold standard where gold was backing currency, and back way back, it was food crops and storable commodities, like you're saying, that were the store of value and represented currency, right? And so you're right. When the farming degraded, or there was huge droughts, or they were over farmed, which happened to the Romans, they were over over farming, um, and degrading their soil and extracting too much, sending it to Rome. That's when things started to collapse. So yeah, fascinating stuff.
so thinking about that, and a lot of people in the regenerative agriculture movement, some of them are thinking about this, and they're kind of looking at the true storage is the capturing of sunlight into the plant and drawing down that energy and storing that as the resilience in your soils, and your soil and your farming space and the area that you're managing or caretaking is um, the economy of health, if you will, or the economy of financial success in the
That's
future,
the
and that's
entire
kind
economy.
right, and that is the
Yeah,
economy, and so
that's the economy.
that's really interesting. So you mentioned that you got really into aquaponics. Let's talk about aquaponics a little bit and kind of your walk through there and what's exciting about aquaponics and why is it kind of why do people get drawn so much into aquaponics? Is it the chase of the harvest or no
So you want
weeds
to
or what? Yeah,
so you want to
talk a
talk
little.
about the aquaponics cult is what you want to talk about, and how I am rehabilitated from a being a aquaponics cult member. That's what you're asking, right?
I
Yes.
wasn't thinking of it like that, but that's pretty interesting take. Let's elaborate on that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, um, great question. So yes, I after college, after getting into first synthetic hydroponics and then realizing what am I doing, getting into organic hydroponics pretty quickly. The natural evolution from that is aquaponics, which is a form of organic hydroponics that uses fish poo, fish manure in water as the primary nutrient source, right? So, and then you have this symbiotic relationship between, certain bacterial strains that break down that fish waste, and then that makes the nitrogen available to plants. And it's like this, little ecosystem where the, you know, microbial life in plants filter the water for the fish and it's, recirculates, right? Great idea on paper. um, Super cool. The reason why people get so interested is because it's really cool. It's like this symbiotic system, right? And because it is a form of hydroponics, the plants grow really fast, right? Which we can elaborate on if you want. But basically, if you go into the history of aquaponics, I have a whole YouTube video on this, which is heavily commented and hated on by the aquaponics cult. Um, but if you go into the history of aquaponics, it was started in the U.S. Virgin Islands, which it made a lot of sense there because it was a hot climate. There was very sandy soils, so and they had to import most of their food. So it started at the University of Virgin Islands as a project, and they were like, well, we could grow these tilapia, which are basically tropical, subtropical fish that grow in bathwater temperature water. They can grow in really dirty, filthy water, and they grow really fast. So you can produce those fish as, for aquaculture as a protein source, right? So that was smart. And then they were like, oh, well, we can process all the waste of these fish because in aquaculture, you got to do something with, all the fish waste water. And so, like, well, what if we, created a biofilter and added plants? So then they were growing huge amounts of lettuce and greens, which was really helpful in the Virgin Islands because if, I don't know if you've had lettuce that's sat on a boat for a week, but it's not very good.
Yeah.
um, so that allowed them to produce fresh produce in an area that had very sandy, poor soils and a place where food imports were very expensive. Same with the fish.
And so what time period are we looking at? When is this
Uh,
being pioneered?
Gosh, I'm terrible with dates, but 1970s and 80s, I believe, is
Okay,
when
so this is
this
all
was happening.
relatively very, very new.
Relatively new,
This
yeah.
is after the plastic boom. So
Right. So
they're using plastic,
yes,
I'm assuming PVC from the get-go in
uh,
this
yeah,
kind of
HDPE, like there are food safe plastics that were starting to be used already, but yeah,
Mhm.
like all sorts of different plastics for the
Okay.
fish tanks and for the deep water culture beds that we're growing these plants in, right? So yeah, long story short, great idea. Still is a great idea in subtropical warm climates where there is poor soils. Still a great idea. However, the problem became when people were like, wow, this is so cool. Let's do this on a home scale. Let's do this on a small scale, right? And let's take it to Colorado and Michigan, right? That's where things started to go wrong. So, as a result, if you fast forward, what you see is people trying to do aquaponics in Colorado, like I was doing, on a small scale, on a home scale, and wondering why their fish are dying and wondering why their plants won't grow, right? So it has to do with, the temperature, right? So you want to grow tilapia, they don't survive the winter. And in fact, they don't really eat very much unless the water is above 75 degrees, which is very warm. And so spring, fall, definitely winter, it's cold, they're not eating very much. And if they're not eating very much, they're not pooping very much, and therefore they're not producing the nitrogen source you need for the plants, right? And then the aquaponics cult will respond with, oh, we could just use bluegill or catfish or goldfish or koi or, fill in the blank. Trout. Trout are like the worst. Um, but what happens is those fish also really prefer to eat in warmer water, right? So basically, anywhere north of like Phoenix, Arizona, you're pretty much going to have a problem with aquaponics, right? And then you get people like putting their fish into converted, you know, top open freezers and adding heaters and like adding all these different things. And then, oh, what if the power dies? Then the fish lose oxygen and in 2 hours they're all dead. Oh, well, now I need a battery backup in case the power goes out. And so it's just like one thing after the other. And I was fully in this world. I was doing aquaponics. I did it on a commercial scale, helped out on a farm in Florida. Then I was doing it on a home scale, and then I was teaching people, and I was working for an aquaponics company, and I was just like deep in. And eventually, with all of the different additions and me trying with my mission of trying to make growing food easier for people, I was like, wait a second, what am I doing here? Um, and one of the biggest takeaways was, wait a second, if I'm feeding these fish, mostly GMO fish food, but that's a separate topic, to a whole nother topic, to get them to produce nitrogen. Why would I do that when I have an abundant source of urea, nitrogen, that I produce myself multiple times per day, every day, and I can't stop producing it if I could, right? So why would I maintain these fish when they're such a hassle to maintain when I could just provide the nitrogen source myself, right? So that's kind of where I started. Well, after losing probably 60 full size tilapia to a power outage, is when I stopped. But anyway, that's that's the summary.
Well, you just got into a totally huge topic that is very loses a lot of people, or is fairly divisive, because I assume what you were talking about, the urea that you are producing, most people are like, I don't produce urea. How do you, what are you just, where's your
Am I a mutant?
urea coming from?
I'm a mutant. No. So I have God gifted me with a built-in omnidirectional fertilizer applicator just below my waist. And so it's urine. And so uh, men and women all produce a huge amount of urea, which is a byproduct of the food that we eat, the excess, nitrogen, ammonia that we have to expel, and it comes out in our urine. And that urine is almost on par with commercial grade urea fertilizer. Not as strong, it's quite a bit weaker, but it's pretty good. So it's an amazing fertilizer. I got a whole video about it. People love it. And yeah, I'm sold on urine as a fertilizer. And it's not just me, and it's not just for gardeners. This is a huge movement in India and African nations where they're basically sticking it to Dow Chemical and all these, fertilizer companies, and they're like, you know what, we're actually just going to produce this ourselves, and we're going to start harvesting our urine. We're going to mix in a little wood ash, and there's a lot of studies and trials, and it works better than commercial grade fertilizer, and it's renewable, and it's abundant, and so I'm I'm pretty excited about P.
Right, right. And realistically, in the regenerative movement, it's totally fine and cool and trendy if it is the animals, the cows, the sheep, the chicken, that is expelling their nutrients and creating nutrients for the plants. But it's kind of a taboo market, trying to sell your suburban mom on this system, right?
Yeah, and
That
using P.
you're talking about.
Yeah, we have alternatives, right? Like On a larger scale, I do use a chicken manure liquid slurry, which smells delicious, but that's also extremely high in nitrogen. And there's some other alternatives as well. But yeah, I mean it's weird. People get grossed out like, oh, my pee. What are you gonna pee on your vegetables? It's like, no, you don't pee on your vegetables, right? So as soon as you add it to a system where there are abundant microbial life, right? It ceases to be urine very quickly, right? It's really not urine anymore, right? So when it exits your body, it's urea. There's a natural, you know, denaturing process that has to happen where it breaks then into ammonia. And then from there, the microbes break it apart into its constituent parts of nitrate, nitrite, etc. And it's used by plants readily. So as soon as it's in there, within hours, depending on the strength of the microbes in the system, it's not urine anymore, right? And as long as you're not applying it to the exterior leaves of the plant, right, then it's it's fine. It's like any other. It's just like animal manure. There are, of course, issues where, you know, and there's even debate on this. Trace pharmaceuticals, right? If someone has to take some sort of pharmaceutical drug that is going to pass through in their urine, and then depending on what it is, could or could not be uptaken by those plants. That's going to depend on a variety of, you know, what that molecule is. Is it going to be recognized by the plant? Is it going to bind to something else that the plant wants, and then it's going to take it up, right? So it's totally going to depend. But yeah, so there's some considerations there. Other than that, it's pretty clean, and all the other stuff that might be in there, there's stuff that plants want and there's stuff that plants don't want. So they're just not going to take it up. And if you've got enough carbon in the soil, it's going to break down and bind any, other toxins, quote unquote, that are going to be in there too. So, you know, and if you're eating clean food, then your urine should be pretty clean and should be good to go. So I think that aside from all of the mechanical complexities of trying to raise fish on a small scale and then grow plants as basically a byproduct. Aside from all that, there is the big question also in organic hydroponics and certainly in synthetic hydroponics that where's the soil life, right? There's the soil food web, right? I think that there are probably things in the soil. Well, I know this because this is just how science works, that we don't know yet. We don't even know they're in there. We haven't been able to identify them, right? So it's like you strip that out, and these plants have been growing for millions, billions of years, like in soil, like, and you're going to expect them to do just fine without soil. I think that's an oversight, right? So the main thing you're going to lose is you're going to lose mycorrhiza. You can add it to, an organic hydroponic soil and do okay, but it doesn't have much of a food source other than roots to feed off of, right? Then you're going to lose the arthropods, you're going to lose the worms. You can get worms into an aquaponic system, but there's this whole array of, microbes and fungi that are present in soil that might or might not be in a non-soil substrate, right? So I think we see that you see that pretty quickly in hydroponics when you're not adding the right nutrients and, the micronutrients aren't there or whatever. Like soil is great because those micronutrients are going to be bound up in the soil somewhere, most likely, and the microbes are going to break it down eventually. So you don't have to necessarily add it. Like it's going to already be there. And then, yeah, so that's one of the main reasons why I went back to the soil, went back to the earth. So, and I still maintained the benefits of organic hydro. So with aquaponics and organic hydroponics, you're going to lose all of that, you know, fungal strains and all the fungi and all the things that we don't necessarily know what are happening in soil, right? So I got back to the earth, I got back to soil, and however, I didn't forget about my organic hydroponics experience. And so I incorporated both basically is, how that's how Revolution Garden was born.
Okay, so for those who don't know what Revolution Garden is, let's talk. We just talked about kind of this evolution of of the revolution garden.
That's right.
Um, let's describe what that is. I know what it is, but for the listeners and viewers, let's talk through what this system is that you've kind of designed,
Sure.
created, and are teaching now.
Yeah, awesome. So it is a growing system for annual vegetables that grows double the harvest, goes twice as fast, uses 90% less water, and helps eliminate pests. It reduces pest occurrence dramatically, right? Um, the high level is basically it's a fusion or a hybrid of organic hydroponics and soil. So that's the summary.
So describe what it is to somebody. Like if they were going to look at a revolution garden, how can they recognize, oh wow, that's a revolution garden?
Well, they can't. It's disguised. It looks just like a raised bed. So it's a raised bed in disguise. But what you would realize if you looked closer is that there are billions of tiny green monsters inside. It's thriving with tiny green monsters. So it is a 3-layer garden system that incorporates organic hydroponics at the bottom. And then there's a barrier in between the normal hydroponic media and then the soil. Lots of things happen when you do that. So it looks like a raised bed, might look like a double high raised bed maybe because we've got some water that needs to be held underneath. And then where the plants grow is just going to look like a regular old raised bed. You can do that out of wood. Some people are doing it out of metal. Um, and yeah, that's what it looks like. So you would know that it was a revolution garden by the fact that the growth is absolutely absurd. It doesn't look like a struggling garden. It's like, oh my God, what is happening over there? It's just exploding it's just like monster plants coming out of it. So I guess that's how you would know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, and the weeds end up being at a minimum mainly because the plants grow so big and fast. They just like shade out the weeds, right? They grow so quickly.
And it's in a
Um,
raised bed context. So I mean, most raised bed gardeners don't really have huge weed pressure, with the exception of maybe Bermuda grass coming up and under and
mhm,
doing that.
exactly. Yeah, and the Bermuda grass isn't, or anything for that matter, is going to come up through it, so it blocks that as well. Um, so yeah, I mean, the way you can tell is it's basically a raised bed that just has absurd amount of growth coming out of it. um, yeah, and I mean, do you want to talk about a little more how it works and kind of explain that? I mean, maybe some of the science behind it. Like, would
Yeah,
that be interesting?
let's walk people through how it works, how they might get started if they're interested in it, and maybe some upfront investment costs. Um, and yeah, just walk us through start to finish on one of those things.
Fantastic. So we can go with one of the reasons why it works, which is I find fascinating, which is when you plant into the soil, the roots will go down and they will hit a root barrier that is going to be basically running up along a hydroponic media substrate, which is basically just rocks, right? And those rocks are going to have a bunch of water inside that's going to be flooding and draining, right? Just like kind of a classic hydroponic setup. And when that happens, the roots are going to be exposed to enormous amounts of oxygen. It turns out that plants really like oxygen. The roots really like oxygen. And when that happens, it basically increases the efficiency of the growth tremendously because the roots need oxygen. And normally what they do is they take water and they split off the hydrogen and the oxygen. They harvest the oxygen and use it for various biological processes, right? When you give it a ton of oxygen directly, it gets to skip that step. It doesn't have to split off the water into hydrogen and oxygen anymore and use it, right? So that creates a huge boost in growth. And that's the reason why you see hydroponic systems and they tend to grow, about twice or three times faster. It's the same thing. And the reason why is oxygen, right? Now, in regular soil, you can get oxygen into the soil by, having worms create, little micro pathways and having decaying roots creating those micro pathways, but you're still just not going to get the same amount of oxygen into those roots, right? It's just not going to happen. So that's one of the reasons it grows so fast, right? Um, from there, however, the way it differs from organic hydroponics is you're going to have a ton of fungal life as well. It's going to be supporting those plants even further, increasing their nutrient uptake efficiency, and so on and so forth. So now I guess we can go into like how it works, but you can envision like a basin of water, right? That's just kind of hanging out. It's standing there. There's a small pump that pushes that water upwards into that rock layer, right? And that pump has a small timer. It's going to kick on for about 15 minutes every hour, and it's going to flood that bottom layer just about 2 inches, right? And then it's going to drain out. And in that time that it's drained out, which is 45 minutes to an hour, that amount of time is where the roots are getting bathed in oxygen, basically. When they're getting wet, that's when they're getting their nutrients and their water, right? Then you've got a layer of actually used frost cloth that sits on top of that rock layer. And then we've got soil. I tell people they can use pretty much any organic potting soil because the reality is that the plants are mostly drawing their nutrients from the water. And then they're going to rely on some amendments that are in the soil. They're going to break down over time, right? Just like a regular garden, as well as the presence of mycorrhiza and different fungal strains. And that's the setup. So
Right. So that's it. Now, you say that pump is running 15 minutes every hour. Does that cost a lot to run? Is that
no, yeah. So because of the way it's set up, on a small home scale garden, whether it's 3 by 6 feet or 4 by 8 feet, the water only needs to rise probably a maximum of like 4 inches, right? 4 to 6 inches, right? So it doesn't need to run that high. It also doesn't need to run that strongly, right? So the flow rate on the pumps are really low. So if you look at the pumps that I use for those size gardens, it's this big. So it's about the size of like I don't know, 4 postage stamps is the
right?
size of this pump. It's very, very small. It pulls such a small amount of energy, and you can get them for like as little as $12, right?
Yeah, so I used to build ceramic fountains in high school, and I
Oh,
would use, I think, a pump probably very, very similar, if not the same
yeah,
pump, to
yeah.
push water up and then come down some sort of, desktop sound, making water fountain. So it's that small of a pump now, and it's running 15 minutes every hour. And is
Mhm.
that around the clock? Do you shut it off at night?
Turn it off at night, right? So the plants aren't really going to benefit from that too much at night. So it just runs during the daylight hours, and then it's off, right?
And it's not running on the top of the surface of the soil to where it's flooding the soil down. This is all a wicking system, correct?
Yeah, it's there is a wicking action happening. The soil will wick a little bit of water into it, but it's really more that the roots are going to be touching that area. They're going to be brushing up against that water, and the roots are going to do the wicking action, right?
Gotcha.
So, yeah,
Now,
exactly.
now, when you're establishing plants and you
Mhm.
have young plants or transplants going into a revolution garden, do you water the top with like
We
you would
do.
a normal garden?
Yeah, we top water for just 2 weeks
Uh-huh.
until those tap roots get down and establish themselves and are able to access that water. And then from there, you basically never water it again. So you top off the water reservoir that holds the water, just like you would in a hydroponic system. We have some students who they set up like automated like float
Float.
valves.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah.
so like they literally never ever think about it. They never water it. They never think about watering it, and it just grows. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the design elements. You said you can make it out of wood, you can make it out of metal. What would be an advantage on one or the other?
It's a
Or
great question.
specifically for the context of growers,
Hmm.
there's probably an advantage one direction or another.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I live in Colorado. It's very dry. And so raised beds, regular raised beds, if you set them up here, are going to last a pretty long time, right? Especially if you stain and seal them. People in more humid climates, like Paul, who's, the founder of Seatime, obviously, is in a more humid climate. And he was the one who's like, hey, you should make these out of metal. And I'm like, oh, good idea, because it never crosses my mind because it's so dry here. But he's like, yeah, this kind of thing will decay faster. Um, so yeah, you basically it's just a frame, right? So whether it's wood or metal, it's just a frame to hold the contents inside. We use food safe liners that hold the water, they hold the soil and the rocks and all that jazz. And now here's where people freak out about plastic, right? So um, it's food safe plastic, right? So it undergoes a lot of testing to make sure that it doesn't leach. That said, um, you know, plastics tend to leach when they're exposed to high temperatures, sunlight, or a variety of factors, or like hot water. In our system, the sunlight never touches that food safe plastic, and so it remains cool all throughout the year, and therefore is not going to break down, right? Side note, I was saw something on Instagram that was like, plastic, food safe plastic, no such thing. And it's like, I don't know if you've been to an organic farm, but they're farming plastic. It's just black rows of plastic all over the ground. So, and it's exposed to sunlight. So if you're buying organic food thinking you're not getting some sort of plastic in the mix, like, you're wrong. So food safe plastic is everywhere, even in organic agriculture. Good news with us is that we don't expose it to the sun. It's completely covered. So anyway, just want to touch on that because you say the word plastic, people freak out.
That's an
So yeah.
interesting observation. I think there's so many challenges because my farm is a polyculture farm. We do use polyfilm because the alternative
There's
is
weeds.
is weeds and weed management, and even with poly, you're fighting it, and again, there's a transition point for it. And I think there's a valid argument for microplastics. So, just putting that out there, what do you think? I'm also looking at the advantage of this system that you have for a home gardener and going, you don't have to invest significantly in irrigation and timing. And then I think you said earlier there's a 90% water savings.
Hmm.
Talk a little bit
That's right.
about that.
Yeah, so it's basically just a recirculating agriculture system. So the only water that is lost is water that is absorbed by plants or that is lost to evaporation. We keep evaporation to a minimum because of it doesn't circulate too often. Um, there's also ways to mitigate that by, you put a cover over the reservoir. It's like a slat of wood, basically, and that helps cut down on evaporation. But yeah, I mean, it's 90 to 99% less water. Um, there's a little bit of water that ends up hanging out in that top part in the grow bed, and that helps just keep the plants moist. Um, and yeah, so it's huge water savings. One, because I mean, here I'm really looking forward to it when I get these bigger gardens grown because I'm off the grid here. There's no well. It's going to be rain catch and hauled water. And so that's going to be a big blessing for me because I'll just get to top it off a little bit every once in a while, right? And the other thing is, I think is even bigger, is just having to get out the hose once a day, maybe even twice if you're in a really hot, dry climate. Like, that gets old fast, right? You basically just never need to do that. You don't even have to think about it. You can go away on vacation and the
Hmm.
garden will grow and you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to have a garden center. So that's a huge benefit, especially for people where it's dry or they want to grow a lot and still want to have a vacation.
So let's talk about initial investment on designing and building one of these beds for a four by
Sure.
eight uh, bed. What's the average investment for that? If you're buying timber, hardware, pump, soil medium, rock, frost cloth.
Sure. So I'm pretty bad at those like hard numbers, which I should be better at, but you know, You can build one of that size for probably $150. That is going to vary widely on a number of factors. I typically say, based on some calculations I've done, is it's going to be 22% more. It's going to cost 22% more than the average raised bed, right? So, you're going to have the wood. You can also convert a existing raised bed into a Revolution garden, so you can take advantage of that, already having the wood and the soil. So, it's 22% more, right? That's going to vary depending on current lumber costs. 2 years ago, lumber cost was insane. Now it's come down quite a bit. Also, how resourceful you are. Can you reuse and resupply stuff? We also have ways of doing it more dirt cheap. So it's like you can bury it in the ground and you can not use wood, right? So that's an advantage. And so basically you're looking at either way, you're going to need the food safe liners, which I mean, they're pretty cheap. You can get a set to do a 4x8 garden for like 10 or $15, right? You're gonna need a pump. It's gonna be like $12. You're gonna need a timer. You can get those as cheap as 8. There's a couple of little components that are gonna cost like $5 to $8. So it's all these couple little costs. It's not crazy. And what I tell people when they're like, "Oh wow, like I'm gonna have to invest in building this garden," I'm like, "Yeah," and it's gonna grow probably on the low end, probably hundreds of dollars worth of produce, especially these days when you consider the price of food and inflation. I mean, I have a friend who he's the last person to ever grow anything, and he's now asking me about it because like, hey, my wife went to the store and she came back and her bell peppers were like 450 each, and I was like, and so he's like, so we should just grow these ourselves, right? I'm like, yeah. So,
Yeah,
yeah, people are definitely feeling the hit of when they go to the grocery store, and it's like, yeah, sure, you can shell out some money to build this garden, and then you can enjoy the benefits of free food for the next 10 plus years,
yeah,
right? So
it's the ROI. Now, quick
exactly.
question: what do you do in the winter, and what do you do in the summer for heat? Are you still doing principles of shade cloth, or like where do you locate these things? Can you put them in a greenhouse? Can you put them outside of a greenhouse? Like
Yeah. So
direct
we've got
sun, everything?
yeah, so we've got a commercial scale version in a greenhouse. It's in a hoop house. Um does pretty well. I'm not there managing it this year, so fingers crossed. um, but yeah, so it's very large. It's 7 beds that are 22 feet long each and 3.5 feet or 4 feet wide. So it's pretty big. But to answer your question, in the winter, you can do simple season extension, hoops, plastic, whatever. I have a training called the Lost Season, which is about how to make thermal mass cold frames so they hold heat a lot longer. Um, and here, I mean, if you do it that way, you can add 1.5 to 2 months on either side of your growing season, no problem. Um, so additional project, but if you want to keep growing, you can do it. In the summer, here's the cool part. We have a lot of students in Arizona and Florida and Texas and some very hot climates. And the cool thing is when you circulate the water around the root zone of the plants, it cools them off and it helps a lot. So on top, that soil might be heating up, but underneath, you've got cool temperature water circulating around the roots, and that prevents wilting and helps them, resist going into photorespiration rather, and it just helps a ton. So that alone helps. And then, of course, I don't recommend it, but you can get into shade cloth if you need to. We find a lot of people don't even need to go that far. They just use the garden, as needed. One pro tip is you can take the reservoir and you can bury it. So we have people, which also saves on material costs. You can dig a hole and you can put the reservoir in there instead of having it above ground, and that keeps the water even cooler. So which helps the plants grow even better in the summer. So
Now,
that's what we do.
when folks are doing that with a reservoir, do they have to add some sort of support or frame in there, like with cinder blocks, or?
If your soil is super sandy and really loose, then maybe, but we've never had needed to have anyone do that. Like,
Other
you
than
just
that, they
dig up,
just cut the edge and then they put the liner down, and there's where the reservoir is,
and
and
that's
then
it.
they
Yeah.
can make the bed a little bit larger on the outside
Mhm.
of that.
Yeah, you can
Um,
hang it over the edge. Like,
mhm.
what I've done is, some of our folks have done is, you dig a central reservoir and then you kind of put the beds up against, the edge of that reservoir so you can feed multiple beds with the same, reservoir hole. You just put a simple cover over the top, um, wood or shade cloth or whatever. Um, and yeah,
Because really, the reservoir is just that landing zone for that water. It doesn't have to be the whole length of the bed
no,
or the
it's
whole
just
size of the bed.
it just has to be sized appropriately in order to have enough water to supply the garden. I had I don't know, in a garden I did for a friend, we did like a 3x3 hole at a 2 foot depth, and we fed like four 3x6 gardens on that. So it's not a lot,
Very cool.
not a very big hole. Yeah.
And so you're just measuring the volume of the space in your reservoir and the space of where that water is going to occupy in that bottom layer of the top bed or box.
Yeah.
Um,
I have a little calculator actually that does it for you. So
awesome.
that we have, yeah.
Now, beyond that, would folks that set up a float valve be in trouble once that water is pumped into the other space and then draining back into that reservoir?
That's
How
a
do
good
how do you
question.
how do you get through that?
So with that, we just have them run the float valve only at night, right? When there's no, the water's not leaving at night because we're not putting it into the beds. So as long as it fills at night, then there's no problem. That's going to be okay. That's what was exhausted today. This much
Makes
is
a lot of
probably
sense.
pretty
So
small.
how do you set up a float valve to only run at night? Is it an electronic float valve or is that water on an irrigation timer that turns on at night?
Yeah. So it's that's exactly right. So it's a nighttime irrigation timer that'll turn on, and then the secondary thing is the float valve, right? Which will only let it go on if it needs to rise up, right?
Very cool.
So
I knew people were going to have some questions on that. Well, I want to, that was, first of all, thank you so much. That's just so
you're welcome.
cool. Like what
It's a
people
deep dive.
have the capacity to do um, with this technique. What are the biggest challenges? I'm sure there's troubleshooting that has to be done, and there's no
Mhm,
silver bullet in farming or gardening. So, what are the biggest challenges for? Let's talk a little bit about pests,
uh-huh.
and maybe disease pressure, and then maybe a little bit on. Have you ever seen um, sodium buildup or alkalinity buildup from that reoccurring reservoir? Let's talk through that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So regarding sodium buildup or alkalinity buildup, never seen it, never had a problem with that. Um, because we're adding fresh water back, and because there's no synthetic nutrients, right? If we're hydroponics, like hydroponics requires reservoir flushes, right? You got to get rid of it because basically, quote unquote, salts build up, and you got to get rid of it. Never have anything like that. Um, what can happen is you can get some downward pH pressure going towards acidity because there's quite a lot of nitrification happening in the process, which is going to release hydrogen ions and is going to reduce the pH. So that sometimes happens. I haven't honestly had to deal with it that much because the soil acts as a big buffer. So for anyone who's, done organic hydroponics and experienced or aquaponics and experienced all the chaos that happens with pH and how to stabilize it, like having the soil present pretty much takes care of that. So that can happen. Very rare though. Um, and then your other question about pests. So one of my favorite topics, you and I jam on this quite a bit, which is awesome. But so, as we know from John Kemp, the master, pests only show up when there's a nutrient imbalance or deficiency. Um, we address that first by, I don't know if I mentioned this, but we put urine in the reservoir and then it gets converted into nutrients. what I found before I even learned of John Kemp's work was that when I didn't add enough urine or have enough nitrogen source in the water, I would start to see pest problems. Adding more nitrogen source usually will correct those pretty quickly, right? People tend to worry like, oh, I'm adding too much. You almost can't add too much, right? The the biofilter and the tiny green monsters are going to process that really quickly, and the plants are going to uptake it pretty readily. So you almost can't go too heavy-handed on the urine in the system. Um, Sometimes we do have, or you see some pest predation of various types, and for that, there are some things I add to the water. I actually developed a whole line of nutrients, organic nutrients called Revolution formulas that go with Revolution Garden, and we basically make sure that one, the roots of the plants can uptake everything they need. We do things to prevent nutrient lockout and just make sure the roots are just ready to uptake macro and micronutrients. Um, and then I also have a blend of chelated micronutrients. It's just kind of a broad array of chelated micronutrients that we can add to the water, and that usually knocks pests out pretty instantly, right? So we can nerd out on that if you want, but basically what I've done is, I know that John Kempf has his line of stuff for gardeners, which I think is great because he mostly has been focused on farmers, and it's like if you have a lacewing problem, then they're going to hone in on that. They're going to do the sap analysis and they're going to just get crazy with like the exact nutrients they're going to need. In a garden scenario, you're not sending your, tomato leaves to the Netherlands for sap analysis with FedEx overnight, like for $150 a pop or whatever it is. You're just not
Right.
going to do it, right? So you could if you're a big nerd like me and you, but um, you're not going to do it. So I came up with a broad spectrum way to kind of just cover all of it, right? And cover all of the micronutrients that are most likely to be deficient or imbalanced or help correct some of those other nutrient imbalances. And we just add that, and that tends to do the trick. So, yeah.
Man, that's really, really wild. So I'm looking at this design and I'm going, okay, we've got 90% water savings. We've got a system where for the home grower, obviously not for commercial growers for law and reasons, but for the input reasons, you've got this closed loop input system and you have a system where you're actually lowering your alkalinity. So the whole West Coast should be growing in this style if you want to have a home garden.
That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. To your point about commercial growing, we do use chicken manure in our commercial uh, version. So it's organic pastured chicken manure from the farm on site, and then turn that and that's the primary nitrogen source. It's not practical to harvest urine, even though we could. There's tons of people there and volunteers and whatnot, but we don't go down that road.
Right.
So there's no urine, there's no pee in that system. Um, but yeah, I mean it makes a lot of sense. Obviously, I'm biased, but I personally don't grow annual vegetables any other way. Um, we have a lot of students who have lots of gardens, tons of raised beds, and they're like, "I'm converting all of them next season. This is amazing. We're just going to convert all of them. We're just Revolution Garden from here on out." And they feel the same way. They're like, "I'm never going to grow any other way. Like, why would I?" Right? So yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, especially at the home garden scale. Now, one of the downfalls of this style, if you will, is we aren't really developing larger landscape soils to help regenerate the planet. We're growing food, but we're not regenerating the planet. We're not regenerating soils. We're not doing that at any level of scale. So this is kind of philosophically great for the home, but then where do we go from there philosophically for looking at a community as a whole or a society
Sure.
as a whole?
Yeah, sure. That's an interesting question. I will say I'll out the only downfall of the Revolution Garden system is that it is dependent on a continuous nitrogen source throughout the season, right? If you stop adding your nitrogen source, when I say nitrogen source, you can fill in the blank with urine or blood meal or chicken liquid manure or whatever, then it stops growing. Pests start attacking the plants. It's no bueno. The good news is that urine is free and readily available, right? So, but yeah, it doesn't like in that regard, it has a downfall, right? And as far as speaking more about like regenerating things on a broad scale, there's other stuff, right? Farmers are gonna do things. I am a permaculture designer by training. I still do a lot of that, and I definitely am out here building the soil outside of the Revolution Garden beds. So that's a whole nother world, and I'm big on that as well. So, but yeah, I mean, as someone who wants to grow annual vegetables, lots of annual vegetables fast, Revolution Garden's the way. If you want to do other stuff, like we're gonna grow some wheat out here, we're gonna do something else, right? We're gonna build soil, build carbon pathways, you know, do cover cropping and all that other jazz.
So annual vegetables, this is a really good way to produce them in your own backyard.
Yeah, 100%.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I
And
totally
if
love
you
it.
want to do fruit trees and berry bushes and stuff that's more woody, well, then, we've got trainings for that too. So, yeah,
Right.
you've got to do
So
that too.
speaking of that, where do people find you, James?
You can find me at groweverywhere.com. And front and center on the homepage is the Revolution Garden book. You can grab a copy. It comes with an awesome video training. It comes with a ton of awesome stuff. It also comes with a free pack of Tiny Green Monsters to get started. So anyway, that's that. And you can see a ton of our other growers and hear their stories and see their pictures on there and why they think Revolution Garden's awesome. Not just me. Yeah. So that's where you can learn more.
That's awesome. James, thank you so much for your time today, for being so generous with your knowledge and your wealth of information. I hope people give this a try. I know that every time I talk to you, I'm inspired. Sooner or later, I'm going to build my own Revolution Garden. I just don't know when. Kind of have a lot going on.
Hit me up.
All right, sounds good. James, thank you so
Thanks
much.
much.
And we'll be in touch.
Man, thanks for staying tuned all the way to the end. We're so excited that you're here, and that probably means that you enjoyed what you heard and you found some value in it. If you could, go and share this with somebody that you know. That really helps push it forward in the algorithm. Hit a like, a subscribe, hit a review. It makes all the difference for us. Thank you for listening to the How I Grow This podcast, and we are dedicated to bringing more of these stories to you to help you grow at the next level. We'll see you.